One of my favorite stories about St Francis of Assisi is that one afternoon he approached one of the brothers in the friary and he said, "Brother Leo, let's go into town today and preach." And so the two Franciscans went into town and made their way to the marketplace. They walked around and around and around for a couple of hours. And finally, Brother Leo said, "Francis, I thought you said that we were coming to town to preach." And St. Francis replied, "We just did. Now let's go home." You see, everyone in the town knew who they were. They knew Francis' reputation. They knew that he had given up a life of material wealth and possessions and pleasure and comfort in order to give his life totally over to Christ. A well-known quote of St. Francis is, "Preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words." Now, most of us here are probably not called by God to live a radical life of poverty in the same manner that St. Francis did. But we are called to preach the gospel in ways that are consistent with our own vocation, with our own individual circumstances. In our second reading today, St. Paul tells us of the joyful responsibility it is to preach the gospel. He writes, "Although I am free in regard to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so as to win over as many as possible." Paul recognizes the seriousness of this responsibility and is willing to do whatever it takes to win over souls for Christ. And his motivation for this is love. Love for Christ and love for others. In our gospel today, we see Jesus' public ministry beginning to take shape. He leaves the synagogue and enters into the house of Simon Peter, where he heals his mother-in-law from a fever. Now, you have to keep in mind that during Jesus' time, a fever was quite serious, especially for adults. I mean, they didn't have Tylenol and Advil back in those days, and so this healing was a really big deal for the people of Jesus' day. Mark also tells us that Jesus was driving out demons from those afflicted. And Mark uses the word drive. He was driving them out. He wasn't politely asking demons to leave. He was confronting evil somewhat forcefully. And this good news spread to the point that people were looking for him. And so Jesus had gone off to pray. And when Simon Peter finally finds him, he says, "Where have you been? Everyone is looking for you." And Jesus responds, "Well, we need to go to other villages so that I can preach there too." It was as if Jesus was saying, we have to spread the good news elsewhere. And so they did. And it's still being spread today. And of course, this is where you and I come in. Jesus' ministry of sharing the good news continues in a very real way through us. It is our responsibility as Christians to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Because you see, if it really, truly is good news for us, then spreading it should cause us happiness, should cause us joy, should cause us peace. Pope Francis wrote about this in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium. In it, the Holy Father writes, quote, "The joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness." Now, note that the Holy Father is not saying that an encounter with Jesus means that we will rid the world of sin and suffering. But what he is saying is that we can help our brothers and sisters in difficult and challenging times by walking with them, by accompanying them in dark moments of their lives. And so when we are there for someone who is going through a tough time in their marriage, or lend a listening ear to someone whose son or daughter is going down a destructive path, or go with someone to the doctor to receive test results, these are examples of what an encounter with Christ looks like. You and I seeing Christ in others and being Christ to others. This is the encounter with Jesus that the Holy Father is talking about in his letter. It's how Jesus' mission continues today, and it's how we put into action the words of St Francis of Assisi to preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words.